Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Lori. I'm here with Dan Hughes, and we also have Andrea with Digital Silver Imaging with us today. Dan's going to be doing a fantastic presentation because he always does. And this is with Tonality Pro. Dan actually did work for MacFun and had a really important role in helping to develop this product. So he knows the ins and outs of Tonality Pro. We also have Andrea here as well with Digital Silver Imaging, so I'm going to let him talk a little bit about his company and why these are such a good match. So, Andrea, go ahead and tell everybody a little bit about Digital Silver Imaging and why you're such a good match with Tonality Pro.
Well, we started as a company, as a lab in 2008, and our basic product is black and white print directly from a digital file. So you upload a digital file to us, and we go directly to a silver gelatin print. So we actually use a projection process on the light-sensitive black and white photo paper. Now, a lot of other people do this, but they use a color paper and basically print black and white on it. But our paper is just black and white, so you get all the benefits of a silver gelatin print, which are long archival life, extremely light fast, and you never get a color cast. So we really think that we have the best black and white product on the market, and Tonality Pro is such a great match for what we do. When we get files that are processed in Tonality Pro, they invariably print beautifully. I mean, almost every single time.
Great, fantastic. Well, thank you so much for being a part of this. We're real pleased to have you folks with us. Okay, so Dan, he is the assistant professor at RIT now, and he is teaching all about photography. So I'm going to go ahead and let him take it away. Dan, thanks so much for doing the presentation. We look forward to it.
I'm honored to be here. Thank you, Lori, and Andrea, and Eric as well. I haven't webinared in a while, so I might be a little bit rusty here at first. But like Lori said, I did have a bit of a hand in developing Tonality Pro. I worked with Dima and the engineering crew to sort of refine as much as possible while we were working on Tonality Pro. And we're going to be talking all about black and white this evening, of course. I've got a little bit to talk about in terms of some functionality that Tonality Pro does have for color stuff, but we are getting into the nitty-gritty of black and white. I've got my first image open in Photoshop right now. Tonality Pro can work as a standalone. We're going to be using it as both a standalone as well as a plug-in to Photoshop. Before I do that, and actually I'm just going to go ahead and launch so you can see the interface, I want to mention a couple things about black and white, and really one of the benefits of the silver process that Andrea was talking about, and that is, and we're going to look at this quite a bit. There's a huge difference between sort of contrast and tonal range, and then there's a difference between, obviously an inkjet print, which is primarily what we see, a lab-based print, which is a chemistry-based print that is on a color paper, which is another thing that Andrea was talking about, and then a silver-based print that is, chemically driven as well, which is what they offer. And then a couple different sort of kinds of paper types as well that they offer too, which you can check out on the DSI website, definitely. And this isn't the best image to show you the difference between sort of a tonal range as well and contrast. We'll get into that in a little bit, but I want you to sort of look at the differences when we can point them out. In this case, this is an image that was shot with a 10-stop neutral density filter, and I'm getting some issues because of that. If I go back to the color version of the photograph, you can see I've got some flare down in the corner, and I'm losing some areas of black down in here. We're going to use this photograph to sort of illustrate some of the really cool functionality that's fast in Tonality Pro. And then we're going to get into it and hit it a little harder with some of the really powerful tools. Yeah, so I've opened up Tonality Pro, and my interface might look a little bit different than yours. I've sort of customized it a bit. So when you initially open up Tonality Pro, it likely looks like this, or it has a whole bunch of different sort of portions of the interface open. Note, mine only has one of the tool sets open at a time. This just makes it easier for me to really pay attention to what I'm doing. If you're interested in this view, if you move up into the view section, notice how my checkbox here is on single view mode. I've got that on. This is just a thing that helps me with my own interface, because if I've got all of these different tool sets open, I've got to scroll through them all, and it's harder for me to navigate. I try to keep things as simple as possible so that I can work as quickly as possible and get as much control as possible. So that single view mode sounds simple, sounds a little bit silly to talk about, but it's really handy. So I like to keep that on. Now, with that, we've opened the interface. I'm going to move into the lower right-hand corner of the interface here and just click right into the presets. Right? This is a fantastic starting point for basically any kind of workflow that you might be doing, whether you're working in a color workflow, within Lightroom, or you're here within Tonality Pro, or you're using Intensify Pro, or anything. Presets are a really handy way to go because it does most of the work for you right off the bat. And then you can sort of fix those things. You can tweak them as you see fit. So right now I'm in the vintage section, but if I click into the presets in that lower right-hand corner, I've got 12 different categories that I can choose from. And I'm going to go ahead into my basic categories. You see my thumbnails are auto-updated, so I can see exactly what my image would look like. And even better than that, if I were to click into, let's say, the adaptive exposure preset, note my image changes. And if I were to use my arrows, right or left, I can actually toggle through each one of these presets. Now, with that, let's say I like boost clarity. If my preset is maybe too strong overall, each one of the presets has its own little sort of opacity slider. So I can click on that opacity slider and just dial that to the left. That's going to remove the boost clarity, in this case, the preset that we're using. This comes in really handy because you can start mixing presets together. You can layer them all together. So maybe I like 50% of that boost clarity. Well, I can go and dial that in however we see fit. The other really great part about Tonality Pro's interface when using these presets is that typically with other tools, using presets, it does some stuff on your image, but you're not exactly sure what it does to the photograph. Here within Tonality Pro, if you move over to the right-hand side of the interface where the Tools palette is, any tool that's being utilized, or any tool set rather, is going to be highlighted in orange, or this sort of yellowish tone. So you can see tone is highlighted in yellow, clarity and structure is. Those are the two tools that are being used with this particular preset, as opposed to tone curve. Right? Tone curve isn't being used, so it's not highlighted in yellow. Whereas if I go and maybe click on, and let's try a different preset because it'll give us something completely different. If I move into my film emulation presets, which are 20 of the most popular film type emulations, if I go and click on an Agfa Pro 100, here I can see my color filter and my tone curve are being affected, as well as my grain. Right? So all of those things are being affected. I can see that, and then if I don't necessarily like something or I need to tweak something, I know exactly which tools palette to move into to be able to adjust those different things. Now, those are your presets. I kind of like this Agfa Pro 100. Another cool thing that you can do here, again, is tweak those adjustments. So we'll go into the color filter in this case, and I just want to take the blues down. I want to darken anything that was initially blue. I want to make it darker so that it renders a little bit darker. And in this case, the sky should have some blue in it. So if I take that to the left, I should be able to get some darker tones out of the sky. We'll go a little bit more in depth into the color filter tool set because it's a really important tool set, and this is one of the ways of either emulating different film types or simply controlling the different aspects of your black and white photograph. There's a preset in here that I think is under Vintage, if I remember correctly. Under Vintage, there's Collodion, so that one's cool, and then there's Orthochromatic, which is an isochromatic. These are different ways of creating black and white images. So an orthochromatic, maybe they're not red. Shoot, what's the term I'm looking for? It's not sensitive to red light. We'll get into that. It's cool, and what's awesome is you have the control to do that. Whereas, and just as clicking on one more preset, I'm going to click on Collodion Wet Plate preset. This is a historic process, right? And with that historic process, it is very early in the photographic history and was very limited in terms of the spectrum that it was sensitive to. And what's cool about that is that this is actually going to emulate that effect. And what's wonderful about that is that you don't have to be a chemist to be able to create this effect. All you have to do is be interested in photography and have Tonality Pro to be able to sort of create this kind of effect to emulate these historic kinds of processes. All right. So that said, I'm going to go ahead and click the Cancel button on my in the upper left-hand corner. Again, we've launched the interface from Photoshop. There are only a few little differences from launching from Photoshop as opposed to launching Tonality Pro as a standalone piece of software. The upper left-hand corner would be some of those little differences. So the Apply button is going to apply our effect onto our image back in Photoshop. The Cancel button is going to go ahead and cancel it. I'm going to go ahead and just hide Photoshop for now. We're going to move into our next photo, which you'll notice is a CR2 image. It's a raw file from a Canon camera, and we're going to just go ahead and drag it directly into Tonality Pro. It's one of the other benefits of Tonality Pro. You can use it as a raw processing piece of software. And right off the bat, what the tool is going to do is convert the image from the raw file into a usable file here within Tonality Pro. Intensify Pro is the same way. You can use it as a raw processor. It isn't as fully functional as a raw processor as something like Lightroom or Adobe Camera Raw from Photoshop. So if you have, an Adobe product, or if you have a raw processor, I would generally recommend using that. But if you don't, yet you're shooting raw, this will work without an issue. And it does a really good job of compressing tones if you have any sort of issues. The raw process here is really quite nice. It doesn't have the lens corrections and some bells and whistles that some of the other tools do have for raw processing. In terms of black and white processing, this goes way above and beyond what you can do within Lightroom or within Photoshop if you're going to be working in any kind of decent workflow. Now, here in the upper left-hand corner would be those differences, right? Again, we open this as a standalone. Here in the upper left-hand corner, we have an Open Image button and as well as a Save and Share button. So this is the difference. And I can go from here and export it directly to Facebook or Tumblr or SmugMug if I wanted to put it right up on my website, or I can open it into different photo editing tools as well directly from Tonality Pro as a standalone. All right. Now, typically I would start this image off with a preset. I tend to work with presets and then just add layers in Tonality Pro to sort of get exactly what I want. For our sort of presentation purposes, I'm not going to start with a preset because I want to start running you through some of the really powerful tools that you have within Tonality Pro. One of the tools that you do have, and again, this is that I've turned on that might not be on within your Tonality Pro if you already have it, or if you don't have it and you download a trial or you purchase it. This is an option that you do have, the color temperature, but it's not on by default. You can find that by going up into your view and then hide color temperature. So this would be, it's a show color temperature in the view section. Now the reason you might want to do that is if you are shooting raw and then you take a raw into Tonality Pro, if the in-camera color temperature is not perfect, you can adjust it in here. And you say, well, how do you do that? The image is in black and white. There's a little trick for that. What you can do is go into the color filter section. And like I said, you probably won't be doing this for every single photograph, but if you ever need to, you can. You move into the color filter, click into the saturation section, and then I can just go ahead and take all of my saturation sliders up to 100 so then I can see my color temperature. And thankfully in this image, the color temperature is pretty spot on, but if it wasn't, I could go and adjust that. I could make it cooler, warmer. In fact, I like it a little bit warmer in this case. But I'll go ahead and set it back to right about where it was. Maybe move back into my color filter. And I'm just going to hit the reset button. You'll note each of the each of the tool sets rather has a little reset button to the right of the label. So I can go and reset that so that I've got my black and white image. We'll get more into the saturation section in a couple minutes and the luminance section of the color filter. Very, very important tools for converting color digital images to black and white photos. Now, starting from the top, working our way down this tool set very quickly, the tone section of Tonality Pro offers us, to the nth degree, really fantastic controls over what's happening within our black and white photograph. And as I mentioned before, there's a difference between contrast and sort of tonal range or tonal gradations. What I mean by that is if I go into the contrast section and I just start bumping up contrast, what that tool is going to do is it's going to make the lighter tones in my image brighter. It's going to make the darker tones in my image darker. But it doesn't give us all that much control over what's happening sort of in between. It does a good job. It's very pretty. But before I would get into the contrast slider, I might recommend using your highlights, your midtones, and your shadow sliders because it offers just a touch more control over what's happening in the image itself, as well as a lot of times I'll cut right into the tone curve. So the tone curve section is a really important tool, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Back into tone. So exposure, this is basically a brightness adjustment. It works in a slightly different way than a standard brightness adjustment because what it wants to do is emulate photographic exposure. The standard slider basically slides all of those tones to the right, so it brightens the image. If I slide it to the left, it darkens the image. Adaptive is a really interesting tool. It's kind of like brightness or exposure 2.0. What this does is it attempts to brighten the image as I slide it to the right, but it wants to retain the brighter values in the image. Right? So if I slide this all the way up to 100%, notice how this wall here doesn't go so bright that I lose detail. Right? It's not blown out. So what this offers us, if I double-click on the adaptive and I slide this to the right, notice how my highlights, they're just blown out. They're gone. They're bright. Right? So I wouldn't use that to 100% probably pretty much ever, but what I would do if I wanted the image to be slightly brighter overall is maybe take my standard brightness up 10 or 12 in this case, and then take my adaptive brightening and bring that up just a little bit. So that's going to give us these nice sort of tonal values in the highlights. Right? The whole image is getting a bit brighter. I'm going to go ahead and actually skip contrast for now, and I'm going to move into the highlights, the midtones, and the shadows. These sliders allow us to control those aspects of the image, so the highlights being the brightest values, the midtones being sort of the middle values, and then the shadows being the darkest values. And for anyone who maybe those are unfamiliar terms for, another really fantastic feature, and I think I might be going really fast for some folks, and I do apologize because there's a ton of stuff in here and I get really excited. I apologize for that. But if we move into the upper right-hand corner of the interface, first off, you've got a histogram up here. Right? So that histogram is telling us exactly what our image looks like in terms of the data that we have in the photo. The stuff on the right is the brightest values, the stuff on the left are the darker values. The greatest part about this is that if I scroll over my histogram there, I have what's called a zone system, right? Or a zone mapping system, as we really call it here in the digital realm. And what the zone mapping system does is it tells us exactly where our tones are in terms of our values from the very darkest, which would be 0, to the very brightest, which we're going to call 255, right? We're on a scale from 0 to 255. Zone 10, so in that upper right-hand corner, if I go ahead and click on X, I'm going to go ahead and click on 0 as well. What we can do now is get a good idea as to what's really bright. So anything that has those little red lines on them, that's really bright. That's zone 10. And we don't have any zone 0 right now. There's nothing that goes black. And in this image, I want there to be a full tonal range from something that's completely black to something that's completely white. And to do that, I've got a whole bunch of options within my tones, but I'm just going to go ahead and skip into my shadows, and I'm going to drag that down and to the left until I start to see my zone 0 starting to show up. Right? And what that's telling me is when I make a print of this, that zone 0 will be pure black. There will be no detail in there, which is exactly what I want in some portion of the image. Right? Now, there is a big difference between, I'm going to go ahead and turn on zone 5 as well, that's middle gray. There's a big difference between having something like this, which is just a ton of contrast, and having something that has a wide tonal range with nice smooth gradients, right? And that's one of the other differences that you can get from using something like Tonality Pro and then getting a stunning print made, is that you're going to have that full tonal range, and it's oftentimes a very important thing. You know, it's not always the most important thing, depending upon the work that you're making, but it is definitely very important, especially if this is a new foray for you into black and white work. You know, you typically want to get these sorts of things down, train your eye, so then you can create anything you want to create in the creative process. Now, I like what we've got so far in our tones. I actually want to take my adaptive back down a little bit. I'm going to leave that at 0. Let's look at the before and after. It's very subtle little difference. There's the before, there's the after, but we've got these nice tones starting to really pop. Before I move into clarity and structure, as well as further down, actually, let's skip into color filter. We'll get into clarity and structure on a separate layer. I'm kind of just changing it up as we go here. But the color filter here, this is going to allow us to control how the colors from the original color image are converting to black and white, right? Because we're not just throwing away all of the original color information that we had in the original photograph. We're utilizing that so that we can basically create, again, any photograph that we might want. And this is a way to really control how the tones come out in the photo. So, for example, I have my color filters, which these are pretty awesome. I don't find myself using just the color filters too often. If I do, I mix them together and brush them in layers, which is another technique that I'll hopefully be getting into in a couple minutes. But these color filters emulate what a glass color filter would do when shooting black and white film and shooting with a blue color filter in this case. Right? So it limits what color lights or what color light comes through the lens and then hits the film. And if I click on the red color filter, you can see a dramatic shift. Basically, a red color filter brightens anything that's red and darkens anything on the opposite end of the color spectrum. The blue color filter brightens anything that's blue in the image and darkens anything on the opposite end of the color spectrum. So that being said, you know, skin tones are typically red and yellow. So if I click on the blue color filter, that skin tone is going to darken down dramatically. Now, I'm not going to go ahead and use one of those color filters. What I want to do is move into the luminance sliders themselves and just adjust the tones. So I'm going to take my red value down just a bit and my yellow value down just a touch, so we're getting these kind of nice tones going on in our monk's robes. And then I might even, I don't think we have too much blue in the image. Yeah, so we're not going to see any shift at all as I slide the blue back and forth. But if we had any blue at all in the photograph, you know, you'd be able to see a pretty dramatic shift. Right? As I slide red all the way to the right, you see his skin tone brighten up. If I slide it all to the left, you see the skin tone darken down. We're going to stick with that. I like what we're getting. Now, the image isn't fully balanced right now. I want to draw your attention as the viewer in towards our subject, in towards the monk there. So what I want to do is leave this layer as it is. I want to create a new layer, and I want to sort of start to work specifically in different portions of the photograph. Right? So one of my sort of favorite parts of a workflow is working a macro to micro sort of workflow. That is, do the big stuff first, and then make your way into the smaller, more specific stuff as you move forward. So this first layer, you know, oftentimes you might get it done within a preset. In fact, all of the work that we just did, we probably could have just done with a preset. But I wanted to explain all of these different things to you. That said, we would maybe click on a preset, adjust it here and there as needed, and then we'd move into the Layers section of Tonality Pro in the upper right-hand corner and simply click the plus button. This is going to give us another layer, which we can name if we want to. I can double-click and name it if maybe I just wanted to work on the monk or you know, the background or whatever we needed to work on specifically. You can rename those by double-clicking and then adjusting. But what we're going to do, I'm not so concerned with the naming, is I want to actually really draw your attention in towards the monk. So to do that, here in black and white, I'm going to brighten monk just a touch. And then we're going to add clarity and structure into the garb, into his clothing there. So I'm not going to worry too much about his skin, and I'll show you why that is in just a second. But I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to add a little bit of standard contrast and a little bit of smart contrast, which, by the way, we haven't talked about this one yet. The smart contrast slider, if I slide that to the right, you get this nice sort of soft glow to the contrast. If I slide it to the left, it's this really kind of harsh flattening of the tones. This is an adaptive adjustment, which means it affects certain tones in the black and white range from black to white more than other tones. And what that does is it creates a unique kind of contrast, which is, yet again, a different way of controlling the photo. Right? I'm just going to add a little bit of that smart contrast, and then I'm going to move into my clarity and structure. Now, clarity and structure are detail and texture controls. You might be familiar with the clarity tool within Adobe Camera Raw or Lightroom's Develop module. This is a very similar tool to that. One of the differences is that this is actually optimized for black and white imagery, as opposed to the clarity tool within Adobe Camera Raw, which is a more general tool that's designed for color, as well as you can use it, if you convert from color to black and white within Adobe Camera Raw. So this is an algorithm that's tuned specifically for black and white, and therefore you'll get more pleasing results, if you will. Now, the clarity tool allows you to add that clarity. The protection tool, it's hard to see probably on this photo. Let's zoom in to about 100% or 85% in this case. I'm going to go ahead and increase clarity. This is way too much. If I go to the checkbox on the right-hand side and we turn that on and off, there's the before, there's the after with the clarity, so you can get a good idea as to what it's doing before and after. But you'll notice a lot of these tools have what's called a protection slider, right? And that protection slider protects the highlights. So if I take my protection slider to the right, you'll notice that the clarity will remain on the darker tones, on the monk and on this area of the photo, but it won't be on the white of the background, right? So it'll actually remove it from those areas as I slide that up and down. And if I bring it all the way to 100%, it starts to protect into these midtones as well. But what this is helpful for is if you want to retain sort of soft, smooth highlights, you can do that using the protection sliders. But like I said, that was too much clarity a minute ago, so I'm going to dial that back down. I'm going to take my structure slider. Structure is basically the texture adjustment. If I bring that up into the right, you can see I'm adding a boatload of texture. Technically, I'm not adding texture. It's just increasing the contrast in a particular way that gives us more texture, or seemingly more texture in the image. I don't really care what happens to the background, because I'm going to show you how to paint the effect in just in particular portions of the image. So what I'm going to do is pay attention to the portions of the photograph where I want to add this structure in. Right? We're going to work selectively. So I'm going to bring that structure up. I will oftentimes actually add too much texture and structure just so that I can see what's happening, and then I dial it down as I go. This is all of these tools, all three of these, are very easy to sort of go overboard on. Right? If I take these sliders way up into the right, you can see it becomes very garish looking. I've got this interesting, cool detail, but the problem with it is that it's everywhere. Right? That's way too much texture everywhere. And what that does is it flattens the tones, it doesn't help to direct the viewer's attention, and it really kind of just looks out of control. So what I want to be careful of is that I don't ever really look out of control, especially if I'm going to be really dialing these tools in. The beauty of these tools is that you can do any amount that you might want to, but you can really dial it in to make it exactly what you're looking for. And then you can even create your own presets as you see fit, whenever you might want to. Now, I like the texture and the tone that we're getting out of his garb. Again, the problem is it's being applied on the entire image. We don't want that, so we want to paint it onto him. We do that by moving into the upper right-hand corner. I'm going to click on the brush in the upper right-hand corner, and I'm just going to go ahead and brush the effect in on him. Right? And what's cool about this, and again, another reason why I kind of like to go overboard on the texture or on my adjustment when I'm painting this effect in, is if I mess up on my brush. right? See, I screwed up over here. What's cool about these apps is that they do work and they are completely compatible with Wacom tablets. So if you have a tablet, you can be painting these things in. This would be much, much faster and much easier if I was using my Wacom tablet. I left it at home. I've been doing a lot of work at home, and so right now I'm in my office, and because it has much better sound quality to it, I don't have a good place to do webinars from home. But notice the texture now. Just from that one layer, we'll turn that on and off by moving into the upper right-hand corner. There's the before. There's the after. I love what it's doing on him. I don't like what it's doing on the background because I screwed up. So to fix that, I'm going to click on my erase button in the upper right-hand corner. And if you're interested in actually seeing the mask, this is a really fully functional sort of masking workflow here. I can move into the upper left-hand corner. I can click the show button, and I can actually see where I've brushed the effect in and where I haven't. What you're seeing is anything that has red on it has this filter applied, right? This layer is affecting these areas. It is not affecting these areas. I don't want it to affect this area, so I'm going to just go ahead and paint that off of him. And again, if I was using a Wacom tablet, I could be much more specific and have a much cleaner brush stroke. And right now I'm just using that trackpad. It's not effective, or it's not overly effective. If that's all you've got, great. But I do recommend using those tablets when you have the opportunity to do that. I am going to avoid the skin that you can see sort of coming through right in there. And the other thing that I'm going to do, because I think we still have too much of the effect, moving back into the upper left-hand corner, clicking the show button one more time. I think we do have too much texture now. I'm going to dial that layer back just a touch. So I'm going to take that back a little bit, and that's going to give us just enough texture on his garb, and it isn't sort of too much. It doesn't look funny because it doesn't not match the rest of the image, and so when we zoom out, your eye sort of is pulled in towards that little extra bit of contrast and texture. I say we add one more layer really quickly. I'm going to brighten up his skin tone just a touch with the tone, and then we're going to move on to the next image for the sake of time and for the sake of making sure we get to all the different stuff that we want to talk about. So I'm just going to paint the effect in on his skin. We'll add one more layer and add just a touch of a finishing effect. So one more layer in the upper right-hand corner. And it might be smart to be naming these layers in the upper right-hand corner just so we can tell what we're doing. Because one of the other cool things about this software is that we can save these as layered Tonality Pro files. So that if we ever want to come back and rework the file, you can totally do that. I'm going to add, how about a little bit of texture? We'll talk more about texture in a couple minutes, but I'm just going to add one of the built-in textures because they look really cool. Something like that, without removing too much contrast. I'll put it on soft light. And then I'll move into the vignette tool, and I'm just going to darken down the edge just a touch. Change the feather. And we'll get more into this stuff in a few minutes. But now what we've got on our image is we went from something that was pretty flat, and we weren't really directing the viewer's attention anywhere, to an image where we're directing the viewer's attention into our subject matter. We're doing it in a subtle way, and we have a full tonal range. So this is going to make a really nice print in the long run. And on this screen, it's a little bit low contrast. On my other screen, as I see it on my other monitor here, it's a little bit higher contrast. So hopefully you guys are getting a good rendition of what you're seeing there. Now, with that, I'm going to go ahead and quit Tonality Pro. We're going to move on, because we only have a few minutes, and I want to make sure that we can cover a couple more things that we have not been able to get to. Let's go into Photoshop this time. Here we've got this nice, clean sort of architectural shot. Let's go ahead and duplicate our background layer. Again, I'm in Photoshop right now. I like to duplicate my background layer when using any of the MacFun products so that I can work in a sort of non-destructive workflow. Because if I go in and I just click on Filter, go to my MacFun software and click on Tonality Pro, it's going to apply the effect to this background layer. I'm not really interested in that. So what I do is I hit Command-J on a Mac or Control-J if you're on a PC. It duplicates that background layer, and then I can just name this Tonality Pro. So that way I know what I've got there in the long run. Because anytime I am working within Photoshop, I like to work in either smart objects or in a non-destructive process using layers so that I can always go back if I ever need to or want to. And I used to think it was rare to do that, but now as the software gets better, and as I train my eye even more, I'll go back to old photographs and I'll start from the initial background layer because my raw processing might have been good, but maybe I want to do something different in black and white. So I like working in those layers. Now, into the color filter. Right? This is a better example of the color filter because you've got a blue sky and a red building and green grass. So just to show you a little bit more, if I click into my red color filter as opposed to my blue color filter, you've got this really dramatic change between each thing. And what's really awesome about Tonality Pro, and this is something that is completely different compared to any other black and white tool that's out there, is that in your layers, and actually they're down here in the update, the layers properties, you have something called the source and the blend, right? And watch this. So if I click into my color filter, let's say I love what's happening to the sky within the image with a red color filter, but I don't like what's happening to the building here, and I like something like the green filter for the building. Right? This is going to make an overall pretty dark photograph in this example. But I'm going to click on the red color filter. I'm going to add a new layer. And this is one of the more advanced techniques. Again, this content is being recorded, so definitely check this out. If it doesn't stick this time, if you've never used these sorts of capabilities before, come back and watch it again because these are really cool and very different from anything else that's out there. So that said, layer 1, has my adjustments. Layer 0 has the color filter. Layer 1 doesn't have any adjustments done to it. Right? But if I move into my layer properties and I tell layer 1 to have a source of the original image, right? Right now it's from the previous layer. If I go and click on original image, watch what happens to the photo. It reverts back to the original black and white conversion. Okay? But what this allows me to do now is if I go and I click on the blue color filter or the green color filter, and then I go into my masking tool and I say, okay, well, I like what the building looks like on this layer, but I like what the background, the sky, looked like on that previous layer. Well, now I can erase, right? I can erase layer 1 using this masking technique. And now what I'm doing is I'm mixing two different color filters together. And I think one of the reasons why I'm so interested in this is that this is not something that was technically possible within a single frame when shooting black and white film. Technically, if you were shooting large format or something and you had two different color filters, you could do something like this and then mix them together in the darkroom, but this would be a very difficult process. Here within Tonality Pro, you're getting this option that is, once you get used to it, relatively simple, even though this is something that's sort of a strange, obscure thing because it doesn't exist anywhere else. But what that allows you to then do is, let's say we like, I love what's happening on the building because those tones look good. I can move into my whites and I can brighten up the whites and I can affect the contrast of just the building, which is not going to affect the background because I'm on layer 1 and I've masked out the background. So this is just, again, something that you have way more control over here within Tonality Pro than you really have anywhere else, especially if you were to try to do this with a film-based process. And then, of course, the beauty of this is that you could send the image off to DSI and you could get a chemical-based print out of this photograph, which would be something that would be almost impossible to do otherwise. Okay. So with that, let's move into some of the tools that we've yet to talk about. We've got our different layers. I'm going to add one more layer. We'll go into our split toning. This is a really pretty tool as well. The split toning has its own set of presets. You've got two different sets of presets for split toning. This was an interesting way of doing this so that it offers basically two different kinds of color presets. If I click into my actual presets in the lower right-hand corner, move into the presets section and choose toning, I have a whole bunch of different color tones that I can choose from. The other way of doing this is if I move back, I'm just going to go ahead and actually reset this layer. So I'll reset that layer right there by clicking the reset button. I'm going to close my presets. I'm going to move into my split toning section here, and here are another group of presets that I can work with. And like I said before, anytime you can work with presets, it's going to speed along your workflow, and yet you're still going to get the control that you're interested in getting. So let's say we love this split toner, but maybe it's way too strong or a bit too strong. You can affect all of your different highlights, your balance, your shadows, and the coloring that goes into those different sort of portions of the image. Or I can just control the overall tone, right? So I can bring that down to 8 or 9%. And so that's going to give me just this very subtle sort of color toning to the image. Now from there, I might move into the glow section. These are these really fantastic kind of finishing effects. The glow tool, I tried to, when we were working on the development of the software, I am interested in something called halation, which was something that was difficult to control and really quite annoying before anti-halation things backing was put on flexible back film. Well, it was put on like T-Max film and stuff. The halation was really pretty though, which was basically a kind of glowing effect. And that was one of the things that we were trying to go after with this glow filter. And what the glow filter does is it allows you to control the amount of the glow that you've got, the smoothing of the glow, right? So you can have a really sort of harsh glow when I've got the smooth down into the negative, or something that's a little bit it's sort of smoother, has a wider gradient or radius. And then you have a threshold. And I dislike using the word threshold, but there's really nothing else that we could use in this case. The threshold is basically which tones are actually being affected. If I bring it to the right, we're going to get this high threshold. If I bring it to the left, we're only going to be affecting the very brightest values in the image, which is the look that I'm going for here. Right? So we're going to get that nice sort of soft, smooth effect with that soft glow. Then you've got lens blur, and although this image I would likely not use lens blur for, I liked showing lens blur with this image because the corners are pretty much tack sharp, right? And what the lens blur filter does is it allows us to actually blur the edges of the image. It's kind of like a vignette in that it starts from the corners and works its way in. But it's, instead of darkening the tones or lightening the tones, it's actually blurring the edge of the image. So you've got a radius, so you can actually get a good feel for exactly what's being blurred and what's not. You have transition, which is the actual gradient. If I bring this transition down to -100, the stuff that's blurred is very blurred, and the stuff that's not blurred in the middle has no blur on it. But if I bring the transition up, there's going to be sort of a softer gradient from the edge in towards the middle. And then the opacity is simply the overall strength. So, you know, let's say we like all of our settings, but it's too strong. I can bring the opacity strength slider down to maybe 30 or so and make it a little bit more subtle. And then you lastly have a place center button. So if the area of interest of your image isn't directly in the middle of the photograph, you can replace that. So right now, and by default, it will be in the center, but maybe if I wanted, or if I had a photo where the interest was over here, I could go ahead and place that over there, and it's going to shift that blur. Now I'm going to reset that, and that resets the place center. And we'll get the texture overlay on the next image. Let's just hit up the vignette. We've only got a couple minutes left here. Hopefully this is a good bit of information for you if you're not familiar with Tonality Pro, or maybe you are and just want to learn a little bit extra. So the vignette tool here, the vignette's going to allow us to basically darken or lighten the edge. Right? You've likely seen these vignette tools before. What's beautiful about this vignette tool is that it can have either a very hard edge, right? Or you can have this very soft, gradiated, feathered edge, and then I can even brighten the center. Now, I love this. I used to use a tool that was called Darken, Lighten, Center. It was within a tool set that I still use, but if I'm turning an image black and white, using Tonality Pro, I just use this instead. So this allows me to darken the edge, but maybe brighten the center point so that I can sort of, again, attract your eye in towards the center point, in towards the subject matter of the photograph. So we can do that, but maybe in a little bit more of a subtle way. Don't need such a vignette. And then you've got photo grain and photo frames. I'm going to show you those on the last photo. Just because I haven't done it yet, I'm going to click the Apply button in the upper left-hand corner so that you can see what happens to the image. But basically what's happening is as I click that apply button, Tonality Pro has to process. It's taking all of those layers and it's making it into the one layer as we go back over into Photoshop. Now, the software is going to work in a very similar way. If you're a Lightroom user and you launch from Lightroom, you just basically right-click on the image, go to Edit In, you'll find Tonality Pro in there. The difference is that in Photoshop, here we're dealing with a layer, and in Lightroom, what you'd be dealing with is a separate file. So you'd have your original file, and then in your Lightroom catalog, you'd have another file right next to the original file. Another cool trick, and this is something that's kind of interesting to do, and I'd like to just see what happens anytime I use Tonality Pro in Photoshop. These are your blending modes in Photoshop, and if I just change this over to luminosity, so if I go from normal all the way down to the bottom to luminosity, what happens is I get all the color information back in the photo, but any contrast adjustments that we made with Tonality Pro, they're going to show up. So to show you before and after there, again, there's the before, there's the after. Not necessarily our goal or intention for this webinar, but just a cool little trick, and it offers other capabilities. And I like that trick because Tonality Pro has a really nice contrast control that doesn't exist anywhere else. Right? So we're able to control the image in Tonality Pro in a way that you can't do anywhere else. All right. So let's go back into Tonality Pro. This is the last photo. I want to show you a couple more tools just so we can make it through everything. And then I'll save some time for any questions that we might have. Also want to show you the color capability that's within Tonality Pro, because of course it is I wouldn't even say fully functional, it's uber functional black and white creation here, where you're able to take your color image, convert from color to black and white. Beyond that, you do have the ability, if I move into the color filter, click on saturation, I can reintroduce all of the color into the image. And this offers me another set of adjustments that I can do, because you've got things like texture overlays, you've got photo grain, and you've got photo frames as well. And these are things like the texture overlay that give you a really interesting look and an effect, and you can't really find this effect in this way anywhere else. And basically, if I go into my texture overlay, click on select texture, I've got a whole bunch of different textures that are built into the software, but then I can even click the load texture button and I can go into, where's my filter, or sorry, my folder, and I've got a texture that I've created before. So this is a texture, it's actually the back of an old camera, it's leather that I shot and works well for a texture. So as I click open, I can go and change my blending mode right here in the interface, maybe something like soft light, and I can get a texture on the image. Right? And just to show you what that does, here I'm zoomed into about 50%. My JPEG is low resolution, but if we look at the difference, there's the before, nice, clean, and smooth. There's the after. So it introduces this really kind of cool effect, which is exactly what I want in the image. I just want it to be in black and white. So I'm going to reset my color filter. I'm going to actually add a preset, and then I'm going to go back in and add a texture overlay again, just like what we just did. I just wanted to show you that was a pretty cool effect. So I'm going to use Boost Clarity. I think it works well in this case on this image. Definitely a nice preset for lots of different kinds of photos. If you're just trying out Tonality Pro, start with those basic presets. They're going to get you, most of the time they're going to give you a really nice effect right off the bat. Oops, what am I doing here? I'm going in my texture overlay. I want to load that filter one more time. Click OK. Set that to soft light. These are different blending modes. They basically just give you a different effect when you're overlaying your texture. And I really like that just little additional texture on that image. And I'm not sure why, because there's tons of texture down here, but for some reason I just like adding a little extra texture on this photo. How about a little bit of vignette on the image? We can tone it in a minute. I'm going to add some film grain, which is going to add another sort of element to the photo. The amount is simply the amount of film grain. The softness is actually the edge softness of each piece of grain that you're putting on the photo. So you can control that to the nth degree, and then the contrast of the grain. And then finally you have photo frames. And the photo frames simply allow you to get this nice sort of finished frame. Some of them sort of emulate what would happen if you were in the darkroom and you took a file to the edge of your to the edge of your darker, your your enlarger film carrier. If you were to file that out, you could get these sort of interesting edges like this. I really love what's happening here, and I'm just going to finish it off with a little extra texture and contrast. So let's actually add a little standard contrast and go into clarity, and I'm going to boost the structure just a touch more. Take a look at that before and after quickly. Here's the original image. It looked nice. It had a sort of subtle feel to it. Now we've sort of bumped up the contrast, added a couple extra little layers of texture, some green, and then that edge. I'm going to go ahead and click the Apply button, but that's about the extent of the demonstration for me.